class! Today's lesson is on the elements of a short story. This is a flipped classroom presentation for my 7th grade English Language Arts class. Now before we begin, I want to point out that you may rewind, pause, or fast forward this presentation at any point. Just remember, work at your own pace and take notes, as this will come in handy when we begin reading other short stories and when you begin writing your own short story. On this slide, you will find each of the elements that make up a short story. They are setting, conflict, characters, plot, point of view, and theme. After this lesson, you will be able to define each of the elements, and you will also be able to provide an example of each. Now, before we begin discussing what a short story is, I want to explain that within this presentation, to help you better understand each element, I will be using examples from the short story Hansel and Gretel, and I will be using examples from the television show SpongeBob SquarePants, because fun fact, these elements pertain to even novels or television shows. Now let's begin. Let's begin by discussing what is a short story. A short story is defined as a piece of fiction that has a developed storyline, but is much shorter than a novel. It can normally be read in one sitting rather than over a span of a couple days. Typically, a short story would include something like a bedtime story that a parent may read to their child in just one sitting. Examples of some short stories are Hansel and Gretel, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, The Gift of the Magi, and The Telltale Heart, one of the short stories you will be reading in class. Now that we know what a short story is, let's take a look at the elements. The first element we'll be looking at is setting. What is setting? Setting answers the questions of where and when. The setting is the location of a story, or simply said, it's where the story takes place. For example, in Hansel and Gretel, the setting is the forest. In SpongeBob SquarePants, the setting is Bikini Bottom. Now, as you might have noticed, some short stories, novels, and TV shows have multiple settings. However, there's typically one location where most of the story occurs and will be identified as the overall setting. The next element we'll be discussing is conflict. What is conflict? Conflict answers the question of what happened? The conflict is the story's main problem. It is what is typically keeping the characters from reaching their overall goal. For example, the conflict in Hansel and Gretel is that both Hansel and Gretel are trapped by the witch and can't get back home. In SpongeBob SquarePants, the typical conflict is that Plankton is trying to steal the Krabby Patty formula. Next, we'll be discussing the characters. What are the characters? Characters answers the question of who. They are the people, animals, or objects the story follows. There are two types of characters we will discuss. The first is the protagonist, which is the main character or main characters of a story. The second is the antagonist, which is the character opposing the protagonist. Examples of characters in Hansel and Gretel include Hansel and Gretel, who are the protagonists of the story, and the witch and the stepmother, who are the antagonists in the story. In SpongeBob SquarePants, the main characters, or the protagonists, are SpongeBob and Patrick, and the antagonist is Plankton. Now let's discuss the next element, plot. What is plot? Plot answers the question of what's the story about. It is what happens in the beginning, middle, and end of the story. In other words, it's the events that take place in a story. For example, in Hansel and Gretel, a simple summary of the plot is the stepmother leaves Hansel and Gretel, the kids, in the forest. They are then lost, and they find the witch's home in the forest, where she lures them in and tries to eat them. Gretel, however, saves Hansel, and they are both able to return home and live happily ever after. In SpongeBob SquarePants, typically the plot revolves around the adventures and life of the talking sponge, SpongeBob, along with his friends Patrick, Squidward, Mr. Krabs, and all the other characters that partake in the show. Next, let's talk about point of view, or POV. What is the point of view? Point of view answers the question of who is speaking. It is the perspective from which a story is being told. Oftentimes, this is referred to as the narrator. There are 3 points of view that we will be discussing. First is the first person, which is when the person telling the story uses I, we, and us. Next is the second person, which is when the person telling the story uses you. And lastly is the third person, which is when the person telling the story uses he, she, it, and they. In Hansel and Gretel, the narrator tells the story from the third person view. In SpongeBob SquarePants, the narrator, also known as the French voice, tells the story from the third person view as well. On the side, there's a video clip in which the narrator of SpongeBob makes a physical appearance for the first time. Let's take a look.
Here we are again at the Bikini Bottom Boating School. Today is once again the day of SpongeBob's boating school exam, but more importantly, this is the last test for the year. And if SpongeBob does not pass this one, it means another whole year of boating school! What happened?
Moving on, let's discuss theme. What is theme? Theme answers the question of why. The theme is the subject of the writing or the underlying message of a piece. It can be a state of being, a moral, or an emotion. Sometimes stories have multiple themes. For example, in Hansel and Gretel, one of the themes is evil never wins. Just take a look at how the witch and the stepmother both die in the story. In SpongeBob SquarePants, one theme is love. SpongeBob loves all of his friends, his family, and of course Krabby Patties. Great! You guys are masters of short stories by now, but let's summarize the lesson anyway. Again, a short story is a piece of fiction with a developed storyline. Remember, a short story can typically be read in one sitting. The biggest lesson that you should take away from this video, however, is that there are 6 elements that make up a short story. They are setting, conflict, characters, plot, point of view, and theme. Setting answers the question of where and when. It tells the location of the story. Conflict answers the question of what happened and tells the story's main problem. Characters answers the question of who and are the people, animals, or objects the story follows. Plot answers the question of what's the story about and are the events in a story. Point of view answers the question of who is speaking and is the perspective from which a story is being told. Lastly, theme answers the question of why and is the subject of the writing or the underlying message of a piece. That's it! You guys can view this PowerPoint presentation online. Otherwise, thank you for watching.